The geopolitical context leading up to the winter of 1941 was defined by the rapid escalation of World War II and the ambitious aims of Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler. Having secured stunning victories in Poland, Norway, France, and the Low Countries, Germany had achieved dominance over much of Europe. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939 had briefly secured a non-aggression agreement between Germany and the Soviet Union, allowing both powers to divide Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. However, Hitler viewed this as a temporary measure. His ultimate ideological and strategic objective was Lebensraum, or living space, in the East, and he regarded the Soviet Union as the final obstacle to German hegemony on the continent. For the Soviet Union, the years preceding 1941 were marked by internal purges, rapid industrialization, and military modernization, though the latter was incomplete and hampered by the recent decimation of its officer corps. Stalin's regime was cautious but aware of the growing German threat. Despite intelligence reports warning of imminent invasion, the Soviet leadership clung to the belief that Hitler would not open an Eastern Front until Britain was defeated. This misjudgment would have severe consequences. In June 1941, Operation Barbarossa commenced. The Wehrmacht launched the largest invasion in history, striking across a vast front from the Baltic to the Black Sea. German forces advanced with speed and brutality, encircling and annihilating Soviet armies. By autumn, German troops stood at the gates of Leningrad and Moscow. The Red Army had suffered catastrophic losses in men, equipment, and territory. The Soviet military, though immense in size, had been poorly prepared for the scale and speed of the German advance. Supply chains were disorganized, command structures chaotic, and communications fragmented. Soviet civilians faced mass displacement, occupation, and atrocities. The initial months of the German invasion appeared to confirm Hitler's expectation of a swift victory. However, as October turned to November, the tide began to shift, not due to a Soviet resurgence, but because of the elements. The German High Command had not adequately planned for a protracted campaign extending into winter. Believing the Soviet Union would collapse before snow fell, they had not equipped their troops for sub-zero temperatures, nor secured winterized fuel, lubricants, or clothing. Rail lines remained incompatible between German and Soviet systems, further complicating logistics. In contrast, the Soviet leadership initiated desperate but effective measures to preserve the defense of Moscow and the broader war effort. Entire industries were relocated east of the Ural Mountains. New conscripts were rushed to the front. The Red Army began to learn from its failures, and Stalin's war cabinet grew more organized in response to the crisis. As the winter of 1941 set in, temperatures plunged below 30 degrees Celsius. German machinery froze, lubricants turned to gel, and frostbite crippled thousands. Soviet troops, equipped with sheepskin coats, felt boots, and adapted supply chains, began to resist more effectively. The harsh environment leveled the playing field, halting German offensives and buying the USSR precious time. This frozen hell was not merely a backdrop, but a decisive factor. The survival of the Red Army in the winter of 1941 was not the result of one turning point, but a confluence of geography, weather, and sheer endurance. It marked the beginning of a long and grueling war of attrition that would ultimately bleed the Wehrmacht dry. The events of that winter would be remembered not only as a test of Soviet resilience, but as a foundational moment in the broader narrative of the Eastern Front. The Red Army had survived the first and most dangerous phase of the German onslaught, setting the stage for counteroffensives that would come in the years ahead. This survival was not inevitable. It was forged in the coldest fires of desperation and necessity. Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, as three massive German army groups surged across the Soviet frontier. Army Group North drove toward Leningrad, Army Group Center set its sights on Moscow, and Army Group South advanced into Ukraine. The initial hours of the operation were marked by complete surprise. Luftwaffe squadrons targeted Soviet airfields, destroying over 1,000 aircraft on the ground in a matter of hours. German panzer divisions punched through border defenses, encircling entire Soviet armies with precision and speed that stunned even the Wehrmacht's own command. The Red Army, caught off guard and lacking clear directives, was paralyzed in many sectors. Stalin himself refused to believe reports of the invasion until the evidence was overwhelming. For several critical hours, no coherent orders were issued from Moscow. This vacuum of command contributed to the rapid collapse of Soviet frontline formations. Within the first week, German troops had advanced hundreds of kilometers, capturing tens of thousands of prisoners and disrupting Soviet communications and transportation networks. The speed and coordination of the German assault were unprecedented. Mechanized columns surged deep into Soviet territory, bypassing resistance and trapping entire units in massive encirclements. One of the largest of these was the Battle of Bialystok-Minsk, in which more than 300,000 Soviet troops were surrounded and either killed or captured. The Red Army's reliance on rigid defensive lines and outdated strategic doctrines left it ill-prepared to respond to the fluid tactics of blitzkrieg. German command structures functioned with remarkable efficiency in these early phases. Field marshals such as Fedor von Bock and Gerd von Rundstedt executed operational plans with ruthless precision. Coordination between ground forces and the Luftwaffe allowed the Wehrmacht to maintain the tempo of its advance, destroying Soviet supply depots and bridges while sowing confusion among retreating units. In contrast, Soviet command was in disarray. Stalin's purges of the military elite in the late 1930s had left the Red Army critically short of experienced officers. Junior commanders hesitated to take initiative, fearing retribution if they deviated from orders. The result was a rigid and slow-moving defensive response that allowed the Germans to exploit gaps and seize key objectives without organized resistance. The human cost was staggering. Civilians in border regions such as Belarus and western Ukraine were caught in the chaos. Cities were bombed, infrastructure destroyed, and columns of refugees clogged the roads, many of them targeted by German air raids. German occupation policies were brutal from the outset, involving mass executions, deportations, and the establishment of ghettos and prison camps. Despite these early calamities, isolated pockets of Soviet resistance did emerge. At the fortress of Brest, a small garrison held out for several days, inflicting casualties on the Germans and delaying their timetable. These moments of defiance, though rare, foreshadowed the tenacity that would later define the Soviet war effort. By late July, the Wehrmacht had pushed deep into Soviet territory. Kyiv, Smolensk, and the Dnieper Line were under threat. German commanders were increasingly confident that total victory was within reach. However, logistical strains were beginning to emerge. The further the German armies advanced, the more difficult it became to supply them. Fuel shortages, extended supply lines, and the inadequacy of Soviet infrastructure began to slow progress, even as the Red Army reeled. The opening phase of the German-Soviet War was characterized by overwhelming force, rapid maneuver, and catastrophic Soviet losses. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The Red Army, though bloodied and broken, was not yet defeated. The first seeds of prolonged resistance were beginning to take root in the shadow of annihilation. The strategic goals of Operation Barbarossa were rooted in both ideological conviction and military ambition. Adolf Hitler believed that defeating the Soviet Union would not only eliminate the last major continental threat to Nazi Germany, but also provide vital resources, grain, oil, and labor for the Third Reich. The conquest of the Soviet Union was seen as essential to Hitler's broader vision of German expansion and racial domination in the East. Moscow, Leningrad, and the Ukrainian industrial heartlands were not only military targets, but also ideological symbols to be subjugated or destroyed. Germany's planning for the invasion was extensive, though marred by overconfidence and fundamental misjudgments. The Wehrmacht leadership, buoyed by previous campaigns in the West, anticipated a swift campaign lasting no more than a few months. German planners divided the offensive into three main thrusts: north, center, and south, aiming to capture major cities, destroy Soviet forces in the field, and force a political collapse before the onset of winter. This strategy, while aggressive, failed to account for the vastness of Soviet territory, the resilience of its people, or the depth of Soviet strategic reserves. Logistical planning reflected these miscalculations. German supply lines depended heavily on rail transport, yet the Soviet railway gauge differed from the standard European one, necessitating the conversion of thousands of kilometers of track. Fuel, ammunition, and food had to be transported over increasingly stretched lines, often through territory lacking proper infrastructure. Moreover, the Germans made little provision for winter warfare. Their assumption of a summer victory meant that troops were issued only light uniforms and that vehicles were not adapted for freezing conditions. German propaganda played a key role in shaping the mindset of soldiers and civilians alike. The invasion was framed as a crusade against Bolshevism and Jewish influence, reinforcing ideological resolve while dehumanizing the enemy. This propaganda narrative also underestimated the Soviet capacity for resistance, portraying the Red Army as disorganized, demoralized, and incapable of sustained defense. The Soviet Union, for its part, had long anticipated conflict with Germany, but was slow to prepare for its eventuality. While Stalin had ordered significant military expansion and modernization throughout the 1930s, the purges had eviscerated the officer corps and introduced an atmosphere of fear and obedience that stifled innovation. Soviet military doctrine emphasized massed infantry and armored formations, but coordination between branches was poor and logistical planning was chaotic. The Red Army possessed vast numbers of tanks and aircraft, but many were outdated or in poor condition. When the invasion began, Soviet strategic objectives shifted rapidly from deterrence to survival. The Stavka, Soviet High Command, struggled to form cohesive plans in the face of rapid German advances. Initial counterattacks, such as those in the Białystok and Smolensk regions, were poorly executed and resulted in further losses. However, amid the chaos, a new strategic clarity began to emerge: delay the German advance, preserve industrial capacity, and stretch the conflict into a prolonged war of attrition, where Soviet manpower and geography could become decisive assets. As the front lines collapsed, Stalin ordered the evacuation of key industries to the east. Entire factories were dismantled and transported by rail beyond the Urals, where they would later form the industrial backbone of the Soviet war effort. Simultaneously, Soviet propaganda shifted into overdrive. The narrative of a patriotic, existential struggle was crafted to unite the population. Radio broadcasts, posters, and leaflets emphasized sacrifice, heroism, and vengeance. Though unprepared in many respects, the Soviet state adapted with remarkable speed. Supply networks were restructured, new divisions raised, and defensive lines improvised. By autumn, strategic thinking had begun to shift from panic to calculated endurance. The Red Army was learning to survive and, eventually, to fight back. The first major engagements between the Wehrmacht and the Red Army unfolded with ferocity and asymmetry. By July 1941, German forces had already encircled and destroyed multiple Soviet armies, creating vast pockets in which entire divisions were captured. The Battle of Smolensk, lasting from mid-July to early September, was a critical early confrontation. Though it ended in a German tactical victory, it marked the first instance of sustained Soviet resistance and foreshadowed the mounting costs of the campaign. Smolensk lay on the road to Moscow and was defended by several Soviet armies. The Germans aimed to replicate their earlier encirclement tactics, surrounding the city and collapsing its defenders. The Red Army, however, resisted with increasing cohesion. Soviet forces launched several counterattacks, clumsy and costly, yet unexpectedly tenacious. German momentum slowed, and the Wehrmacht suffered tens of thousands of casualties. Though the Soviets ultimately lost the battle and over 300,000 men, their resistance delayed the German timetable by several critical weeks. Meanwhile, to the north, the siege of Leningrad began in September 1941. Army Group North, reinforced by Finnish units, surrounded the city and attempted to starve it into submission. Although Leningrad was isolated, it did not fall. The city's defenders, both soldiers and civilians, prepared for a siege that would last nearly 900 days. In the initial months, intense fighting occurred on the outskirts, and supply routes across Lake Ladoga became lifelines. This early phase set a grim tone for the horrors that would follow: starvation, cold, and mass death. In the south, Army Group South advanced through Ukraine, capturing key cities such as Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia, before launching the largest encirclement operation of the entire war, the Battle of Kiev. Between late August and late September, German forces executed a massive pincer movement, trapping over 600,000 Soviet troops in the Dnieper Bend. This crushing defeat shattered multiple Soviet armies and opened the path to eastern Ukraine and the Donbass region. The consequences of these defeats went beyond military losses. Civilians were increasingly drawn into the vortex of total war. Entire populations were displaced as German forces advanced, and many communities were caught in the crossfire. German occupation policies quickly turned draconian. Jews, communists, partisans, and even suspected sympathizers were executed en masse. Einsatzgruppen followed the army's advance, conducting systematic massacres such as the infamous Babi Yar in Kiev, where over 30,000 Jews were murdered in 2 days. On the Soviet side, the Stalinist regime responded with brutal countermeasures. The infamous Order No. 270 branded all soldiers who surrendered as traitors, subjecting their families to persecution. Political commissars were embedded within military units to enforce discipline and ideological purity. Retreat without orders was punished by execution, and entire units were sometimes sacrificed to slow the enemy. Despite these hardships, the Red Army began to show signs of tactical learning. Local counteroffensives, though rarely successful, began to disrupt German planning. Soviet units increasingly utilized defensive terrain, river barriers, and urban environments to stall advances. Mines, demolition teams, and ambush tactics became more frequent. At the same time, partisan resistance behind German lines began to take root, especially in Belarus and Western Russia. German commanders took note. While their forces continued to advance, resistance was stiffening. The expectation of a quick victory was eroding in the face of stubborn opposition, logistical delays, and growing fatigue. The early engagements of 1941 had demonstrated German tactical superiority, but they had also revealed the immensity of the challenge ahead. The Soviet Union, though battered, was refusing to collapse. Instead, it was bleeding, adapting, and preparing for the winter to come. By October 1941, the German invasion of the Soviet Union had reached a critical juncture. Although the Wehrmacht had inflicted enormous losses and penetrated deeply into Soviet territory, its momentum was visibly slowing. The vast distances, stubborn resistance, and deteriorating logistical conditions created mounting difficulties. What had begun as a swift campaign evolved into a grinding struggle. As operations intensified, both sides faced growing crises in command, morale, and strategy. The most urgent challenge for the Germans was supply. By now, Army Group Center was preparing for Operation Typhoon. the final push toward Moscow. Yet fuel shortages plagued armored units, and resupply convoys lagged hundreds of kilometers behind the front. Horses, still widely used for transport, died from exhaustion or starvation. German trucks and tanks, designed for short campaigns in temperate climates, began to break down on the muddy roads of the Russian autumn, what the Soviets called Rasputitsa, the season of impassable mud. Weather began to influence operations in increasingly destructive ways. Sudden rainfalls turned unpaved roads into quagmires. Troop movement slowed to a crawl, and artillery pieces sank into the earth. Aircraft could not operate efficiently under such conditions, reducing the Luftwaffe's ability to provide close air support. German soldiers, still in light summer uniforms, were already suffering from cold-related ailments. Commanders expressed growing concern that the window for a decisive blow before winter was rapidly closing. On the Soviet side, desperation yielded innovation. Stalin ordered the mobilization of every available resource to defend the capital. Fresh divisions, many composed of hastily trained conscripts, streamed in from Siberia, Central Asia, and the Volga region. Industrial relocation eastward had begun to bear fruit, with new equipment and ammunition arriving from beyond the Urals. The defense of Moscow was coordinated under General Georgy Zhukov, whose organizational skill and uncompromising discipline helped stabilize the front. The Soviet rail network was prioritized for troop movement. Trains moved under blackout conditions, and workers labored around the clock to repair bridges and tracks destroyed during the retreat. The Stavka issued orders for the construction of multiple defensive belts around Moscow, including trenches, tank traps, and anti-aircraft batteries. Civilians were mobilized en masse to dig fortifications, lay mines, and evacuate critical infrastructure. For the first time in the campaign, the Red Army appeared capable of proactive planning, not merely reactive survival. Morale, however, remained brittle. Soviet losses were catastrophic, and the scale of German victories had created psychological trauma across the nation. Propaganda efforts intensified, portraying the defense of Moscow as a sacred duty. Images of Nazi atrocities were broadcast widely to galvanize hatred and resolve. The memory of Napoleon's failed march on Moscow in 1812 was invoked repeatedly, suggesting that Russia's winter would once again be the undoing of a European invader. International reactions to the escalating crisis were mixed. While Britain had already declared its support for the Soviet Union, direct material assistance was limited in 1941. The first convoys of the Lend-Lease program were only beginning to arrive via the Arctic route and the Persian corridor. The United States remained neutral, though President Roosevelt expressed growing concern over German advances. Soviet diplomats lobbied for increased Western aid, arguing that their resistance was delaying German domination of the continent. Amid these political tensions and battlefield hardships, the psychological toll on soldiers was immense. German troops, exhausted by constant movement and irregular supplies, began to suffer frostbite, dysentery, and combat fatigue. Some divisions were reduced to half strength. Officers noted increasing signs of disillusionment, especially among younger conscripts. The dream of a short war had faded. In the Soviet ranks, discipline remained brutally enforced. NKVD blocking detachments stood behind frontline troops, ready to execute deserters. October closed with German forces still pressing forward, but their advance was clearly faltering. Soviet forces, though battered and undersupplied, were no longer in full retreat. A massive confrontation near Moscow was imminent. The frozen hell of winter was descending upon both armies, and neither command fully understood how profoundly it would change the character of the war. By early November 1941, the German assault on Moscow, Operation Typhoon, entered its most intense and critical phase. Army Group Center, reinforced and reorganized for the final push, launched a series of concentrated offensives aimed at encircling the Soviet capital from the north and south. The stakes were immense. Capturing Moscow was not merely a military goal, it was intended to decapitate Soviet political leadership, shatter national morale, and force capitulation before winter rendered further operations impossible. The Wehrmacht's advance came in two prongs. From the north, German forces attacked through the Kalinin and Klin sectors, aiming to sever rail links and envelop the city from above. From the south, divisions moved through Tula and Kashira, seeking to close the ring. Despite the deteriorating weather, initial progress was significant. Towns such as Mozhaisk, Volokolamsk, and Narofominsk fell after fierce fighting. German panzers reached positions less than 100 kilometers from the Kremlin, and reconnaissance units reported seeing the spires of Moscow through binoculars. Yet every kilometer was contested. The Red Army, under the command of Zhukov, had committed its last reserves to the defense of the capital. Several new divisions arrived from the Far East, their movement enabled by Soviet intelligence reports that Japan would not attack the USSR in 1941. These Siberian troops, well trained and equipped for cold weather combat, played a critical role in stabilizing the front and reinforcing vulnerable sectors. Urban and forested terrain around Moscow was turned into a labyrinth of resistance. Soviet troops dug in along natural barriers, utilized burned villages for cover, and created networks of trenches and bunkers. Artillery was massed at key intersections, and air defenses blanketed the skies over the capital. Soviet engineers mined roads and bridges, while partisans sabotaged German supply lines in the rear. The cost of these battles was staggering. Entire regiments were lost in the struggle for small towns. Casualties on both sides climbed into the hundreds of thousands. German commanders pushed their men to exhaustion, demanding continuous attacks through knee-deep snow and freezing temperatures. Frostbite and illness began to claim more men than Soviet bullets. Vehicles seized up, weapons jammed, and fuel depots ran dry. Horses froze where they stood, and supplies were looted from abandoned Soviet villages. Inside Moscow, life teetered on the edge of collapse. Civil defense units enforced blackouts, and anti-aircraft sirens sounded nightly. Schools were shuttered, factories converted to wartime production, and entire districts evacuated. Yet panic never fully took hold. Soviet fighters, radar networks, and flak guns inflicted increasing losses. German air superiority, once overwhelming, began to erode as airfields were snowed in and aircraft grounded due to poor maintenance and cold. By late November, the German offensive reached its culmination. The pincer movement stalled short of full encirclement. Soviet counterattacks, conducted with growing coordination and fury, began to push the invaders back from the outer suburbs. The final German thrusts, launched under worsening conditions, achieved only marginal gains at tremendous cost. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht had failed to capture its objective. The peak of the campaign had come and passed. The German army stood frozen before the gates of Moscow, overextended, under-equipped, and increasingly vulnerable. The Red Army, bloodied but unbroken, had held the capital. Winter was now in full force, and the balance of the war was beginning to shift. As December 1941 dawned, the Soviet Union found itself battered but defiant. The Red Army, having survived the worst of the German onslaught, began to adapt. What followed was not a sudden resurgence, but a methodical transformation born out of necessity. Resistance hardened across all sectors of the front. Soviet forces, both regular and irregular, increasingly relied on defensive ingenuity, logistical improvisation, and psychological resilience to slow and eventually halt the German advance. The frozen battlefields of Western Russia became laboratories of survival. The Red Army's first step was stabilization. Commanders such as Zhukov implemented layered defense-in-depth systems, with successive fallback lines supported by artillery and newly established supply depots. Soldiers received better winter gear, felt boots, padded jackets, woolen gloves, and were taught basic cold weather protocols. Unlike their German counterparts, who lacked proper winter clothing and suffered tens of thousands of frostbite cases, Soviet troops were being conditioned to endure sub-zero warfare. One of the most significant improvements was logistical adaptation. Though the Soviet rail network had been heavily damaged, alternate supply chains were developed. Sleds, skis, and even reindeer were employed to move supplies across snowbound terrain. Workshops were set up in the field to repair damaged weapons, and local villages were stripped of usable resources to sustain frontline positions. Soviet engineers became experts at maintaining railheads under enemy fire and keeping vital supply nodes functional despite constant disruption. Frontline tactics also evolved. Soviet commanders, having witnessed the failure of large-scale counterattacks earlier in the campaign, began favoring localized actions, night raids, ambushes, and sniper operations. Units dug elaborate networks of trenches, dugouts, and bunkers that leveraged natural features like forests and riverbanks. The Red Army, once reliant on rigid top-down orders, began to allow junior officers greater operational flexibility. This decentralization allowed faster response to battlefield developments, especially during chaotic weather-induced interruptions. Behind the lines, partisan warfare began to flourish. Operating in forests and swamps, partisan detachments conducted sabotage missions, disrupted German communications, and ambushed isolated supply convoys. These groups, often composed of civilians, Red Army stragglers, and NKVD operatives, created a second front that tied down thousands of German troops in anti-partisan operations. Belarus and Western Russia became centers of resistance, where German attempts at pacification only intensified local support for the Soviet cause. Civilians played a crucial role in the broader war effort. In towns and villages not yet under occupation, men and women dug anti-tank ditches, constructed bunkers, and cleared airstrips. Children collected scrap metal, and women staffed munitions factories relocated to the Urals and Siberia. Morale was bolstered through state propaganda, which depicted the struggle as a sacred, existential defense of the motherland. Songs, posters, and film reels glorified frontline heroes and vilified the invader, binding the population in a shared narrative of survival and vengeance. On the battlefield, small victories began to accumulate. At Tula, a key industrial city south of Moscow, Soviet forces repelled repeated German assaults and launched counterattacks that forced German withdrawals. The defense of Tikhvin, near Leningrad, denied the Germans a critical supply route and marked one of the first successful Soviet offensives of the war. These engagements, while limited in scale, signaled a shift in momentum. The Red Army was no longer collapsing. It was learning, adapting, and retaliating. Psychologically, Soviet troops began to regain confidence. The simple fact that Moscow had not fallen, despite weeks of German assaults, boosted morale across the front. For the first time, Soviet soldiers saw the enemy falter. German troops, worn down by the cold and lacking reinforcements, were increasingly static. Trenches that had been used to resist now served as launch points for cautious Soviet advances. This period marked the transition from reactive desperation to active resistance. The Red Army was still far from capable of large-scale offensives, but it had transformed from a broken force into one capable of standing its ground. The winter of 1941-42 became not just a season of survival, but of strategic recalibration. The Soviet Union had endured the worst, and from that endurance emerged the foundation for a protracted, grinding campaign of attrition that would ultimately turn the tide of the war. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet Union launched its first major strategic counteroffensive of the war. After months of brutal defense and devastating losses, the Red Army struck back along a broad front around Moscow. This moment marked a decisive turning point, not only militarily, but psychologically. The Wehrmacht, previously seen as unstoppable, was now being pushed backward for the first time. The myth of German invincibility cracked in the snows outside the Soviet capital. The counteroffensive was the result of months of preparation, redeployment, and adaptation. Under the coordination of General Georgy Zhukov and the Stavka, Soviet forces had amassed several fresh armies along the Moscow front. Many composed of troops transferred from the Far East after Soviet intelligence confirmed Japan's intention to focus on the Pacific. These Siberian units, trained in winter warfare, were well equipped for the harsh conditions. Reinforced by reserve units and supported by newly constructed defensive lines, the Red Army had achieved local superiority in manpower and armor. The attack was launched simultaneously across multiple sectors: north of Moscow around Kalinin, west along the Mozhaisk-Vyazma highway, and south near Tula. The Germans, overextended and exhausted, were caught off guard. Their front-line formations had suffered immense attrition from frostbite, lack of supplies, and continuous Soviet harassment. Morale was plummeting, and command cohesion was deteriorating. For the first time since the launch of Barbarossa, German divisions were forced into retreat. Soviet tactics had evolved significantly since the summer. Instead of rigid frontal assaults, commanders employed mobile detachments to exploit weak points, encircle enemy outposts, and sever German supply lines. Cavalry units, often underestimated, proved effective in traversing deep snow and executing rapid flanking maneuvers. Artillery was concentrated to achieve local superiority, and air support, though limited, was used more effectively than earlier in the campaign. The weather played a critical role in magnifying Soviet gains. Temperatures plunged as low as 40 degrees Celsius in some areas. German vehicles broke down en masse, lubricants thickened into sludge, and tank engines seized. Weapons jammed in the cold, and medical evacuations became nearly impossible. In contrast, Soviet units, clad in sheepskin coats and equipped with sled transports, sustained offensive operations in conditions the Wehrmacht was wholly unprepared to endure. As December gave way to January, the scale of the Soviet advance widened. Towns and villages recaptured from German control revealed horrifying scenes of destruction and civilian massacres. Soviet propaganda capitalized on these atrocities to fuel national resolve. The narrative shifted from survival to vengeance. The Red Army pressed forward, liberating Kaluga, Klin, and Kalinin, and threatening German lines of communication and retreat. Within the German High Command, panic set in. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, was dismissed. Hitler, increasingly distrustful of his generals, issued the infamous Stand Fast orders, forbidding strategic withdrawals. This decision would lead to unnecessary casualties and the encirclement of multiple German units. The refusal to retreat condemned many divisions to destruction or entrapment in exposed forward positions. Despite initial successes, the Soviet offensive also faced limitations. Supply shortages persisted, and coordination between fronts remained inconsistent. Some counterattacks extended too far, exposing Soviet units to counterblows. Still, the Red Army had achieved what seemed impossible just weeks earlier. The defense of Moscow had transformed into an offensive campaign. The Germans had lost the initiative. The consequences of this turning point rippled beyond the battlefield. Internationally, Soviet credibility soared. Britain and the United States, recognizing the Red Army's resilience, accelerated plans to provide aid through Lend-Lease. Domestically, Soviet morale surged. The people of Moscow, who had dug trenches, manned anti-aircraft batteries, and endured nightly blackouts, now witnessed German troops being pushed westward. The winter counteroffensive did not end the war, nor did it annihilate German forces, but it decisively ended the possibility of a quick German victory in the east. The Red Army had proven it could withstand and reverse a full-scale invasion by the world's most formidable military machine. The Eastern Front had entered a new phase, one of grinding attrition, endless bloodshed, and eventual Soviet ascendancy. The frozen plains around Moscow became the graveyard of Nazi Germany's early ambitions. As the Red Army's counteroffensive continued into January and February 1942, the tide of the war on the Eastern Front irrevocably shifted. German forces, reeling from weeks of Soviet attacks and the unrelenting winter, began a general retreat from their most advanced positions. Though Hitler had ordered his troops to hold their ground at all costs, reality on the battlefield could not be ignored. Army Group Center was being pushed back along a 1,000-kilometer front, its once cohesive lines fractured, its units under strength, and its morale dangerously low. The Soviet offensives extended well beyond the immediate vicinity of Moscow. In the north, the Red Army advanced toward the Rzhev salient, a bulge in the German line that would become a focus of brutal attritional warfare in the coming year. In the south, limited offensives around Kursk and Kharkiv began probing German positions, setting the stage for future operations. While these moves were not always strategically coordinated, they reflected a broader shift. The Red Army was no longer confined to desperate defense. German withdrawals were chaotic and costly. Units abandoned vehicles, artillery, and wounded soldiers to avoid encirclement. Makeshift defensive positions were established in villages and forests, but they lacked supplies and cohesion. Frostbite casualties mounted dramatically. By February, more than 100,000 German soldiers had been incapacitated by cold-related injuries. Entire battalions operated at half strength or less. The offensive spirit that had driven the Wehrmacht across the steppes in summer was now extinguished by exhaustion and bitter cold. The humanitarian crisis on both sides deepened. Soviet civilians in formerly occupied territories emerged from the ruins of villages and towns devastated by fighting. Many had endured months of starvation, violence, and occupation. Survivors told of massacres, forced labor, and reprisals by German forces and their collaborators. The liberation of places like Mozhaisk and Kalinin revealed charred homes, mass graves, and shattered communities. Soviet authorities began documenting these atrocities, gathering evidence for future propaganda and legal proceedings. Simultaneously, the retreating Germans practiced a scorched earth policy. Infrastructure, food stocks, and livestock were destroyed to deny them to the advancing Red Army. Wells were poisoned, bridges blown up, and entire villages torched. This policy left the local population destitute and freezing, dependent on meager Soviet aid deliveries that were often delayed by broken supply routes and blizzards. Inside the Red Army, the cost of survival and counterattack had been immense. Millions were dead or wounded. Entire divisions had been wiped out or reduced to skeleton units. Equipment shortages remained severe. Ammunition was rationed. Medical care was rudimentary, and many soldiers still lacked adequate winter gear. But discipline had improved, training had become more rigorous, and leadership structures more coherent. The experience of surviving 1941 had transformed the Red Army from a disorganized mass into a fighting force capable of large-scale planning and resilience under pressure. At the political level, Stalin consolidated his grip over both the military and civilian apparatus. The NKVD expanded its role behind the lines, hunting down deserters, saboteurs, and suspected collaborators. Order number 2227, not one step back, was still months away, but its foundations were being laid. Soviet society was being militarized in every aspect, from the factory floor to the schoolhouse. Meanwhile, German political leadership refused to acknowledge the strategic failure of Barbarossa. Hitler dismissed commanders who proposed tactical withdrawals or recognized the limits of German capacity. Generals such as Guderian, who urged a more flexible approach, were removed or sidelined. The Führer's insistence on holding every inch of captured ground guaranteed that more battles of annihilation would follow in 1942. As winter subsided and spring approached, both sides prepared for the next phase of conflict. For the Red Army, the winter of 1941–42 had been a baptism by fire. It had not achieved total victory, but it had saved Moscow, bled the Wehrmacht, and demonstrated that Nazi Germany could be resisted and beaten. The immediate aftermath of combat operations left the land in ruins, the population scarred, and the armies dangerously thin. But a turning point had been reached. The war in the East was no longer a lightning campaign. It had become a protracted, total war of attrition. The winter campaign of 1941–42 left an indelible mark on the course of World War II. What began as a confident and ideologically charged invasion by the Wehrmacht had transformed into a catastrophic miscalculation. For the Soviet Union, the winter was a crucible in which disarray, terror, and desperation gave way to cohesion, endurance, and eventual resurgence. The Red Army had survived the greatest military onslaught in modern history, and had halted it before the gates of its capital. This outcome permanently altered the strategic landscape of the war. In the immediate term, the failure to take Moscow ended Germany's hopes of a rapid victory in the East. The illusion of Soviet collapse was shattered. The war Hitler had envisioned as a swift campaign was now a grinding attritional conflict against a vast, mobilized, and increasingly effective adversary. The Wehrmacht, which had counted on overwhelming operational superiority, found itself mired in the very logistical and environmental challenges it had failed to prepare for. The Red Army's survival reshaped global perceptions. In London and Washington, the Soviet defense of Moscow proved that the USSR was not only a vital ally, but a viable one. Though political tensions remained, the United States and Britain accelerated efforts to provide material support. Lend-Lease deliveries, still modest in 1941, expanded significantly in 1942. Aircraft, trucks, food, and raw materials flowed through the Arctic convoys and Persian corridor. Stalin's insistence on a second front would become a central diplomatic theme in Allied coordination for the rest of the war. Within the Soviet Union, the winter of 1941–42 became a foundational myth of patriotic endurance. The survival of Moscow was elevated in wartime propaganda to a symbol of national unity and sacrifice. Public commemorations, literature, and art recast the campaign as proof of the Soviet system's moral and material strength. Stalin's image, though still contested in private, was carefully reconstructed as that of the wartime leader who had stayed in Moscow and guided the nation through its darkest hour. The human cost of that winter, however, defied any romanticization. Millions were dead or missing, soldiers frozen in foxholes, civilians buried in rubble, prisoners starved in makeshift camps. Cities were hollowed out, railroads destroyed, and vast tracts of farmland left fallow under the snow. Disease and famine followed the fighting, particularly in areas like Western Russia and Ukraine, where infrastructure had collapsed and entire communities had been depopulated. For the German military, the defeat had deep and lasting consequences. Confidence in Hitler's strategic judgment began to erode among senior commanders. The attrition suffered in winter left German forces weakened for future operations. Thousands of tanks and vehicles had been abandoned or destroyed, and the rate of replacement could not keep up with demand. Though the Wehrmacht would launch new offensives in 1942, most notably toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad, it would never again possess the strategic freedom of maneuver it held in the summer of 1941. Historians continue to debate the broader implications of the winter campaign. Some argue that Germany's failure at Moscow was the true turning point of the war. more decisive even than Stalingrad or Kursk, because it destroyed the possibility of a short war and forced Germany into a prolonged struggle it could not sustain. Others see it as one of several key moments, each building upon the last, in a war that turned as much on industrial capacity and political will as on battlefield outcomes. In retrospect, the Red Army's survival in the winter of 1941 was neither miraculous nor accidental. It was the result of brutal determination, mass mobilization, strategic recalibration, and the exploitation of German overreach. It demonstrated the unique resilience of a society that had endured purges, famine, and terror, yet could still summon collective strength in the face of annihilation. The frozen hell of that winter was not just a military episode, it was a historical hinge,